Welcome to Early Returns, hosted by Jan Baran, a partner of Holtzman Vogel. This podcast examines law and politics and seeks insights from political players in elections, lobbying, media, and the law. Now, let's join our host, Jan Baran.
Welcome back to Early Returns, a podcast about law and politics. I'm your host, Jan Baran. Our producer is Jody Mayer-Piazza. It's the beginning of a new year, which means it's time to check in with the Federal Election Commission. Each year, I aim to have someone from the FEC tell us what happened last year and what to watch out for in the coming year. As listeners know, the FEC consists of 6 commissioners, 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats, and the agency is responsible for administering and enforcing our federal campaign finance laws. Those are the laws that regulate the money raised and spent in campaigns for president, senator, and representative. I'm pleased to have as our guest today the current vice chairman of the FEC, James E. Trainor III, who everyone knows as Trey Trainor. Commissioner Trainor is a Republican. He was appointed and confirmed to the Federal Election Commission in 2020. He's a proud graduate of Texas A&M University and its law school. Prior to his service on the FEC, he was general counsel to the Texas Secretary of State, and he also had a private law practice in Texas. Trey Trainor, welcome to Early Returns.
Thanks, Sean. It's great to be with you and great to talk to everybody today.
Well, we appreciate you being here. Now, I've given our audience your formal official bio. I'm sure everybody would like to know a little more about you. Kind of personalize things a little bit. Where did you grow up? Tell us a little bit about your background and particularly about how you wound up being a lawyer and eventually getting appointed to the Federal Election Commission. So a little background would be very helpful.
Sure, happy to. So, we all kind of come to the law in a lot of different ways. So I was actually born in the city of Odessa, Texas, out in West Texas, in the Permian Basin, oil and gas country here in Texas. I grew up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and graduated from high school there. Ended up at Texas A&M, where I spent 4 years in the Corps of Cadets. At the same time I was there, I actually enlisted in the reserves while I was in school there. Did some time in both the ROTC program and the reserves. Finished up there. My first job I ever had was working for the city of Dallas, coming out of A&M, having done political science with a specific emphasis on parks and recreation, municipal type management things. I thought I was doing great to get a job at the City of Dallas Parks and Recs program. We actually ran summer programs for at-risk youth, partly funded by what would be known today as like the summer lunch program type activities that went on. Was there for a brief period of time, went to work for the Boy Scouts of America out of Fort Worth, handling a 5-county region. At the same time I was doing that job, there was a gentleman who was running for state rep for a seat that was being vacated by a longtime state representative. So 3 of the counties that I represented, he was running in. And so I kept bumping into this guy at different events. And I'm at the chamber trying to raise money for the Boy Scouts and talk about the Boy Scouts. And he's there trying to get votes and do all these type of things. So we kept running into each other. And eventually one day he just said, "Hey, you want to come work for me in Austin if I win?" I said, "That'd be great. I've never done anything like that." So I ended up working in Austin, Texas as chief of staff to a state legislator. At the time, there was Democrat control of the state legislature, and Bush was still governor. That was right before he was going to run for the 2000 election. That was his last legislative session that he was there, but I had a lot of interactions with folks on President Bush's, then governor, but on the team there. So got involved with things going on with the Bush administration, just as a volunteer on the campaign because their office was based there in Austin. So
the Texas State Legislature, it's not full-time, is it? I mean, how often do they meet and for how long?
Great question, Jan. So the Texas Legislature meets for 140 days every other year. So it's part-time legislature. Legislators make $600 a month like they always have. So at the time they got it, it was probably a lot of money. Now it's barely enough to cover the cost of co-insurance for their families to pay every month, but they're there. So yes, I worked in the legislature for about 10 years. During that time frame, during that off period, I went to law school immediately after the first legislative session that I worked. Went to law school at night. And then came back, took a year off of law school, came back and worked the next legislative session, and then went back and finished Went back and finished my last semester of law school. By the time I'd finished my last semester of law school and graduated, there was a special session going on about redistricting in Texas. And my representative that I was working for was the House sponsor of the redistricting bill. And so I was spending an inordinate amount of time focused on redistricting. And next thing I know, I'm moving around a bunch of people who call themselves election lawyers. And I just finished law school, looking around, and I was like, well, this is really a lot of fun, a lot of things going on. So became intimately familiar with redistricting law, was able to do that for quite a bit of time. The representative that I was working for during his tenure ended up being chairman of an extremely powerful committee. At the time was known as the Regulated Industries Committee. So it handled all of the telecommunications, electric utility, water, all of those type of issues come before the committee. And we spent a lot of time focused on that. I left that job to go be the general counsel of the Secretary of State. Roger Williams, who's now a member of Congress, was the Secretary of State that I worked for, and I was there for a year managing everything. Our big task when he was there was the federal allocation of money under the Help America Vote Act came in. And so we were responsible for getting the distribution of the HAVA funds out and making sure that we have 254 counties in the state of Texas. And we had to make sure that all 254 counties went about acquiring voting machines that were HAVA compliant. So ended up being a big job.
And then at some point, you actually hung out a shingle, right? And started practicing law as an election lawyer.
I did. So with all of that experience in the Secretary of State's office and the redistricting work that I had learned about and those type of things, I had left the Secretary of State's office. I actually went back and did another few months in the legislature. They needed some help on a couple of issues, so I went back there. But as soon as that was over, I hung out my own shingle. Practiced law by myself, picked up a few clients doing a little bit of lobby work, obviously a lot of it on electric utility and telecommunications issues, because that's where I had the relationship with. But more and more, I would get calls from members of the legislature as my former boss, who's now a state senator, Phil King, would say, hey, you ought to call my guy. He's, is helpful. He knows about these things. And next thing I know, I'm representing a ton of state reps and state senators and even some statewide elected officials doing simple things like campaign finance filing report reviews and those type of things. And then some of that blossomed into litigation with election contests and recounts and those type of things. Was in private practice by myself for a while. Then a boutique oil and gas law firm out of Houston called and was looking to partner up. They wanted somebody in Austin. They didn't have an Austin office. And so ended up partnering up with them. Was there for a couple of years. They got acquired by a very large firm, Ackerman, out of Florida. I continued generally doing the same things that I was, but it was at that time that I ended up, we had done some work representing the Perry campaign when Rick Perry ran for president. We handled his ballot access litigation there in Virginia when he didn't make the ballot. And then from there, went on to that next cycle, did a little bit of work for the Cruz campaign. When Cruz dropped out after the Indiana primary, I got a call from my good friend Don McGann, gave me a call and said, hey, do you want to come work for the Winners? And I said, absolutely, let's go. And so I ended up in Cleveland for 2.5 weeks working at the RNC, helping out with the legal team there. Then ended up in D.C. on the transition effort, and then ultimately was nominated to the FEC.
Now, when you were practicing law and representing people like Senator Cruz and then Governor Perry, who was running for president, were you interacting with the Federal Election Commission? Did you have to deal with the FEC as a private practitioner back then?
Actually, I would tell people this, especially when I was nominated. My only interaction with the FEC really didn't happen to do with anybody that was representing for president. I had more representation in front of the FEC representing state reps at the time, because there were this is still before the rules were clear as to what congressional candidates could and couldn't do at non-federal events. And so we would have lots of congressional candidates that would show up to events that their local state reps were having. Republican voters are there and they show up. And we would get several complaints about, Congressman so-and-so is asking for money in excess of the federal limits, or showed up and there wasn't any sort of disclaimer about why they were showing up. And in a lot of cases, it was the fact that this state rep didn't have any idea that the federal candidate was going to show up, other than, it's really funny. I mean, they wrote the same $300 check to buy a ticket just like everybody else. And next thing we know, we're dealing with these complaints. So luckily, I got most of them dismissed and didn't have to deal with too many of them. But most of it was an interaction of non-federal candidates with the Federal Election Commission more so than federal candidates.
Well, now you've been on the Federal Election Commission for coming close to 5 years, right?
Yes.
What have you learned about the commission from the inside that you wish you had known when you were practicing law on the outside and representing people in front of the FEC? Is there anything that was revealing to you?
Well, the most revealing thing to me is, if you're on the outside and never been on the inside and you get a letter that says a complaint's been filed with you at the Federal Election Commission, you take it very seriously and you respond and you're concerned about it and you want to know what the status of your complaint is. Having been on the inside and knowing how slow this process moves on the inside, and as I've testified in front of Congress before, I mean, in some ways, I think the process that we have at the FEC is the punishment more so than anything else. And so at the end of the day, I appreciate and want people to take seriously that there have been complaints filed against them at the FEC. But I also want them to understand that, look, it's not the end of the world, and the process is going to grind very slowly to a conclusion. And at the end of the day, that conclusion, in a lot of ways, some of the things that we end up doing, I think after the fact, are really a non-story and really a non-event based upon all of the hoopla that goes into people publicizing the fact that they have filed a complaint with the FEC. And I'd like to get away from that. I'd like to get away from a situation where people are able to use the fact that they've filed a complaint as a cudgel against somebody and allow people just to come out and say, look, it's not that big a deal. People make filing mistakes. They put the wrong address down. They put the wrong amount down. Little errors here and there. It happens. I mean, we're all human.
Well, you got on the FEC at a time really in the middle of COVID, right at the beginning, didn't you?
It was, yes.
I don't want to get into all the background, but, the commission was really having a lot of trouble, mostly
Absolutely.
because they didn't have enough commissioners to do things, right? And you get
Absolutely.
appointed, you had a quorum for 15 minutes, and then you didn't have a quorum, and then you got reinforcements finally. And I remember from talking to other commissioners from that time that everything was so strange. You even had confirmation hearings at the Senate, which were done remotely online, like we're doing today. So people didn't know what they were getting into. And
for me, it was obviously a strange new world coming from dealing mostly at state level politics, with just a spattering of federal practice in there. My confirmation hearing, I remember my confirmation hearing was one of the last ones that was had at the Capitol before they shut everything down. And at that hearing, I remember looking around they'd extended the dais around the room so that every senator could have a seat in between them. And so, I'm having to look to my far left and far right to answer some questions there because that was the recommendation is everybody needed to be away. But we weren't even wearing masks at that point. So that was what was recommended. That's what happened. And it was unique in that I was a solo commissioner up until my confirmation hearing. There had always been paired commissioners, a Republican and a Democrat had been paired together. But there were only 3 commissioners on the commission, and it takes 4 commissioners to really be able to do anything. There were already 2 Democrats and 1 Republican on the commission. And so they had to put me, they really needed to get me onto the commission just to be able to do basic accounting functions, much less handle anything related to the law. And so you're right. I had my confirmation hearing. Literally, they shut most everything down a couple of weeks after that. I wasn't even sworn in Washington, D.C. My good friend, Justice Don Willett on the Fifth Circuit swore me in at the federal courthouse here in Austin, Texas. We both had practiced there before, and we know people there, and they opened the door for us, and we went in there, and my family and a couple of friends, and that's where we had the swearing-in ceremony for it. And I did. I appeared remotely for most of the time then, and we're still dealing with that, to be real honest with you. We still have a lot of remote appearances in front of the commission. It's now something that
I wanted to ask you about that. How is the commission coming together? Do the commissioners meet in person? Does the staff show up for work? Or is it, there's a lot of discussion, especially in light of the recent election, as to how many government employees actually go to the office 5 days a week and things of that sort. What's the situation at the FEC?
Well, I'll address both parts of your question. As far as the commissioners are concerned, we speak with each other pretty regularly. A lot of phone calls, a lot of back and forth, Zoom meetings, those type of things. Our Republican caucus, we still caucus together. It usually happens via Zoom just because it's easier for everybody to get in. But I mean, some people zooming in from their office, zooming in from home. All of us on the Republican side still have young children at home, so it makes it a little easier for us. Our personal staffs are there in the office. They have the laboring oar on a lot of what's going on. And so there's a lot of conversation that takes place face-to-face amongst them. As far as the professional staff at the commission, they are not there at all, hardly ever, as far as I'm concerned. And it's been a real problem. When the pandemic hit, we had an emergency order to evacuate the FEC. And so everybody had to leave the FEC. And so we got in place all of the apparatuses for everybody to be able to meet and for us to be able to do things via Zoom. When the emergency order was lifted, and I think, what was it, three and a half years later that the emergency order was lifted, the direction from the commission was, okay, everybody come back to the office just like we used to. And the union that represents the bargaining unit at the commission said, no, the status quo has changed. The status quo is now work from home and you have to have a reason to come into the office. And we said, no, that's not it. We went to arbitration and we had a federal arbiter handle the case, and the arbiter sided with the unions. And so now the federal employees have to come in 2 days a week. Well, actually, I take that back, 2 days per pay period, which is 2 weeks. So 2 days per 2 weeks, they have to come into the office. So we were still on this kind of maximum telework. It's really frustrating for me, being a fiscal conservative as I am, because we still are doling out money to pay people to ride the metro to get to and from the office at the same levels that we were prior to the pandemic. So, I think there's money that's being wasted there. If the arbiter says that's what it is, that's what it is. So why do we need to maintain all of the space that we have at the FEC? Why can't we have 3 floors there now. Why can't we consolidate down to 2 floors and people can schedule their time? They're already scheduling when they come into the office anyways. We could schedule and make sure that they have enough time to do that. And, for me, it's interesting because in my last few years at the large law firm that I was at, we had a similar situation where lawyers were getting more and more comfortable working from home and being able to accomplish a lot more and get some drafting done and that type of thing. And you really only needed the office if you needed a conference room for a deposition or, to meet with your colleagues to consult on something. So, we kind of had this hot seats of offices where you just bring in your computer and plug it in and there was a monitor there, but all the files and things were put in another room. And I think some of those same principles could apply at the FEC. If we're going to have this maximum telework situation going on, we need to think about ways that we can help to start to save the taxpayers some funds in doing away with some of the travel benefits that we have, or at least making them match up with the type of travel that the employees have, and then limiting some of the space that we have.
Well, there's obviously the new administration. Incoming President Trump has appointed this unique new operation called DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency. And one of the things that apparently they're going to look into is bringing government employees back into the offices where they're paying rent, right? And they're currently are empty.
Exactly right.
And
exactly right.
What's your understanding about what, if anything, the president can do about bringing employees back to work in light of these union contracts? You've got agreements.
Well, what I think would be great is for, an executive order that says that we need to start to implement that would be great. That would obviously be a change in the status. And I think that would give management effort the ability to go back and renegotiate with the unions to try to get them back into the office. So I think it's a great first step is getting an executive order that says that everybody has to be back in. I think the other thing that you hit on there is just that. It's that, if we're going to have the type of rent that we're paying, and especially in DC for the office space that the FEC has, I wrote an op-ed about this, and it was somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but also, is something that we do seriously need to look at. But I had suggested that the Federal Election Commission ought to be moved to, where I was born in Odessa, Texas, and it's way out in West Texas in the Permian Basin. And everybody chuckles, and even I chuckled in putting it out there. But I wanted people to pay attention to it, so you kind of have to go to the extreme. But when you look at what's going on around the country, in places like Chicago, places like Detroit, places in Ohio that are struggling, where there is a lot of commercial real estate that's available for much cheaper rent than what's being paid in Washington, D.C. for those places, you combine that savings in rent with the fact that the employees in Washington, D.C., our employees are getting a 33% increase in their pay because they work in Washington, D.C. Let's move the Federal Election Commission to some place that doesn't have a locality pay that's so high. So just the cost savings amongst that alone, it's got to be millions of dollars across it may be billions of dollars across the federal government were you to do something like that. But those are the conversations that need to be had. And I'm glad that the new administration is talking about that. And I think getting everybody back into the office is the first step to looking at how we can, in fact, become more efficient.
Well, the commission has a lot of responsibilities and a lot of jobs to do. Maybe the most attention is given to you when you have certain controversial cases, and that doesn't really come up very often, but that's when you might get all the press and controversy. But you all are responsible for processing all the data and all the reports for all of these campaigns and PACs and party committees all over the country. And we've just had an election with a record amount of money being raised and spent in these campaigns for president, Senate, and representatives, and all of the different organizations and super PACs and so on and so forth. So a record amount of money. And all of that goes through the Federal Election Commission, where 70% of your employees are not in the office. So they're working remotely. How have you kept up with all that? What kind of a job has the FEC done on what some people would think be its most important mission, which is public disclosure of what's going on in money and politics? How did that work out in the 2024 election?
Well, I couldn't be more proud of our IT team for the work that they do. They do great work as far as being able to process all of the data and the things that come in. And to be real honest with you, they do it on a system that is very arcane as far as what we know today from cloud-based computing and, kind of the behind the scenes stuff that goes on with all of the reporting. They've done an excellent job with that. The commission this past year has received more grant funds and money from the federal government to be able to upgrade that. And so we're in the process of putting in place a cloud-based system that will help to make those things faster. And I'll give you an example of how it has to be faster. There are a lot of contributions. You talked about the fact that we have a record amount of both contributions and expenditures this cycle, but we have record numbers of low dollar contributions that have come in. There are a lot of people who are giving the $10 and $12 and $15 and $20 checks. And a lot of that's being done through Act Blue and Win Red as kind of major collectors of that. And then,
you might want to explain for our listeners those two organizations and what they do.
So Win Red and Act Blue, Win Red on the Republican side and Act Blue on the Democrat side, they take in funds for a candidate will sign up with them to say, we want you to handle all of our online transactions for donations. And so that's where they get the link on their website to be able to use it. And so they process all of those payments coming in for all of the credit cards and all the information that's coming in. Now, because of the way they operate their businesses, Win Red and Act Blue actually have to report all of those transactions themselves. So if I, Trey Trainor, donate $25 to Jan Baran for Congress, Win Red's going to get a notice saying Trey gave $25, and they're going to report that $25 as having come into Win Red to the Federal Election Commission. Then they're going to send over to Jan and say, hey, Jan, here's the $25 from Trey. And Jan's also going to report that same $25 contribution from Trey. And there's some handling fees and other things like that that are reported in those, depending upon the various business models. But because of the amount of data with every candidate on the Republican side almost for Congress and almost every candidate on the Democrat side using Act Blue, that one report from Win Red and one report from Act Blue is an enormous amount of data that all hits our system at the same time. And this is where I was saying, it's somewhat of an arcane system. We can't handle the processing of all of that data from those two organizations, plus getting in all of the Jan Baran for Congress and the Senate campaigns and those type of things all at the same time. So we've had to set up special accommodations to be able to handle those two bigger reports and get all of those things processed. So it's been a partnership of us going and communicating with those individuals who have to report as to when we can take that data and how fast we're able to process it to make sure that we can still meet the statutory deadlines of when the congressional candidates and the senatorial candidates and the presidential campaigns have to have their information turned in. And again, I hope going forward with a cloud-based system, we'll be able to handle that much better. That allows us to use all of the cloud-based space out there and all of the new technology that's available. But
have there been any delays or hiccups in the public disclosure of the data that's filed with the commission on a timely basis? Do we get the data almost instantaneously, or do we have to wait a little bit? Or are there...
No, we get the data almost instantaneously. I mean, this is where our IT department has been fantastic to be able to make sure that they meet all of their statutory deadlines for the disclosures and the ability of individuals to go get it. Now, I'll tell you what has suffered somewhat in that is the ability of legal practitioners to be able to go online and search other information on the FEC's website. So prior rulings of the commission, those type of things, the ability to do kind of the legal research off of the commission's website has been curtailed a little bit because of that. We also, this past year, had some outside hacks that were identified by the Department of Homeland Security that required us to even shut down even more of some of that access for fear that they may get into some of the other data. Because the critical element in the disclosure is holding on to all of that data, but also making sure that it doesn't get used nefariously by individuals. As you know, there are statutory prohibitions against using individual contributor data to go raise money for other candidates. But we're also very concerned about always just, look, you have somebody's name, address, employer, and occupation. That's a lot of information about an individual. And we try to do our best not to allow just these mass downloads of data, which is what hackers are ultimately looking for, to give them a window into other people's information. They may not get all the information they need from the FEC, but it's a great starting point for them. So obviously very concerned about all of that.
Well, you referred to the FEC website. I think it's good to mention to our listeners that it's www.fec.gov, right?
Yes, that's it.
And I do want to inform our audience that is an extremely robust website, which in addition to all of the campaign finance data that you have on there, you have so much more information and resources available to learn about the FEC, to learn about the law, to learn about all the cases and advisory opinions that you all have issued since your inception, which is now 50 years ago.
50 years.
So there's a lot there. And I hope that the improvements and upgrading that you are referring to in terms of cloud computing and other information will also extend to your website, which is a good one, but obviously needs to be modernized and kept sustained so that the public as well as practitioners can use it effectively. I mentioned earlier that sometimes you get most of the press over controversial decisions or non-decisions at the FEC. I do want to underscore a point, which is that you've made already, and I've referred to in the introduction, is that for the Federal Election Commission itself, the 6 commissioners to do anything at the FEC, to make a decision, to decide whether to investigate somebody, whether to issue an opinion, whether to issue a regulation, there has to be 4 commissioners out of the 6 to do that. And, there's some controversy about that. There are proposals up in Congress to change all that, and to create a super commission where there's somebody, maybe a Canadian could be appointed to be the head of the Federal Election Commission because they would be neutral enough to make Solomon-like decisions on everything instead of having to get together a bipartisan group of 4 out of 6 partisan representatives. What's your opinion about, now you've been in there now for 5 years, how does that work? Do you think it is work? Is it worth
I think that
changing or reforming?
No, I think that so go back to when I first got to the commission, it was, there were 4 of us for a brief period of time. And one of the first things I wrote about with regard to the commission was the dysfunction at the commission that we saw. And a lot of it was partisan based, but not partisan based in the Republican Democrat sense that we talk about, but based upon, it was actually a partisan legal sense, like should the commission defend itself or should we let this become law type situation. And I thought the process was being abused in that. I thought that the appropriate place for the decisions to be made about what the law is was in the judiciary, not through the processes at the commission. I think it's important for the commission to put out their opinion as to what the law is, but I think every every person ought to have a right to have their day in court with regard to the issues that they're being held to account for in front of the FEC. So I think it was important to do that. The commission that we currently have, the 6 commissioners that we currently have, the 2 Republicans that came on after I did, and then we had a Democrat that left, and we had 2 new Democrats that have come on for us to get there. We've been able to function together greatly, and I think that the bipartisan nature of what we've been able to do is very important for the country. And I think you see that most represented in something that happened in this last election cycle. Mark Elias, who those that are on the Republican side will know has been a big representative of Democrat efforts around the country, particularly presidential campaigns over the past few cycles, came to the commission and had some questions about what third-party organizations could do and whether or not it would be coordinated communications with federal candidates if they engaged in that. And there were a lot of fight. He asked for an advisory opinion related to it. And in the process of doing that, we got a lot of comments from the RNC, the Democrat committees, Democrat senatorial committees, from everybody. We got comments from everyone across the board. And what you saw there was that there was this knee-jerk reaction that, oh, well, if Elias is asking for it, it's got to be bad, and therefore Republicans should oppose it. But when my Republican colleagues and I got a chance to actually dig into the issue and look at it, we said, well, this is actually really good for the First Amendment for these organizations to be able to speak the way that they want to speak and to be able to have some level of communication amongst candidates and those type of things. So we actually said, we think what Elias wants to do is actually within the bounds of the law. And we did put some barriers up on, here's where it goes too far. And there were a couple of questions that, we didn't answer them because we didn't really need to get to them. And the knee-jerk reaction, I think, on the Republican side was, oh, this is horrible. Well, it turns out that in the 2024 election, the organizations that used that opinion the most were those that were most supportive of the Republican position. And in fact, since that time, you've seen some on the left who've come out and said, oh my gosh, I can't believe Mark Elias asked for this opinion and let the Republicans run wild. But I think that shows the bipartisan nature that we on the commission were able to come together and give an answer looking at what is the best development of the law, what's best for First Amendment free speech rights, and everybody being able to say, this is the right direction for us to go. So I've never been a big advocate of having just one person, for sure, handle all of these issues. And I think the fact that we actually are required to cross the aisle to get a vote means that we have to, one, we have to be firm in our principles and positions, but we also have to recognize where compromise is available and go see if we can start that conversation. And we actually end up in a lot better place. One of the things that I'm most hopeful for going into this year, we still have an open notice of proposed rulemakings with regard to state parties. And myself and Commissioner Dara Lindenbaum, who's a Democrat on the other side, both of us are very passionate about seeing what we can do to limit regulations on state parties because we recognize that state parties are mostly volunteer organizations. They're mostly volunteer driven, and it's very hard when you're switching out the chairman or the treasurer or the secretary and all of those type of things are changing every year, every 2 years to keep up. And so we want to try to make the regulations as easily to comply with as we possibly can. So she and I have joined together in a bipartisan effort to look at that. And I think what you'll see soon in the early part of this year is a rewrite of some of those regulations that we're going to ask the public to consider and that we'll ultimately be able to vote on.
Well, so this would be for reviewing how state political parties are regulated in terms of the money they raise and spend, which,
Yes.
of course, is more difficult for them than it is for either the candidates, who, of course,
Right.
can raise money for themselves,
Right.
or the national political parties,
Right.
which are better known and have the resources to basically vacuum up a whole lot more money through devices like WinRed and Blue, whatever they were called. So that's a great thing. Is there a rulemaking that started, or is it?
So we do have, again, if you go to FEC.gov, it's there it's one of the pending rulemakings. The comment period's closed for it, but I think we're getting ready to put out some proposals that will also go out for comment for everybody to be able to look at. And you hit on it. I mean, it is very hard for the parties. The other thing that the state parties have to deal with is they're not only dealing with federal candidates, they're also dealing with state level candidates. And all 50 states have different rules for raising money for their state level candidates. But the state parties are in this world where they have to comply with both state level regulations and federal level regulations. And you can't help but have a blend of those when you have one party chairman or two individuals in charge of the party, and they're doing, they're taking one phone call after the other. And, they don't have one phone that says state phone calls and one phone call that says federal phone calls. I mean, they have one phone number. So it makes it very difficult. And yet we still have these rules in place that say, well, we want them to track how much time they spent working on federal stuff versus state stuff. And well, like where you're at, in a state like Virginia, I mean, y'all have a gubernatorial election. It's an off year. Maybe it's a little easier to keep track of the fact that they're focused mostly on state. But in a state like Texas, where you have state level candidates who are running at the same time, statewide candidates run at the same time as U.S. senators, it's difficult for state parties to do that. So, we've got to clarify these regulations and make it easier on them. Because for me, the entire campaign finance system, it's not about a gotcha game. You hit on it earlier. I mean, what the public wants is to know where the money's coming from and where it's going. And so it's a transparency game. And if we want it to be transparent, we've got to make it easy on the individuals who have to comply with it to be able to put the data in so that the public can have access to the data.
Well, it's encouraging to hear that there is this bipartisan cooperation going on and that the commission is able to accomplish things in that spirit currently and going forward. I know one area that has gotten a lot of notoriety, especially just before President Trump's inauguration, is a campaign finance issue that has not come up at the Federal Election Commission in terms of its publicity. It's come up in the context of a state enforcement action up in New York, where he had been prosecuted by a local New York prosecutor who happens to be a Democrat, very democratic city, in front of a jury of his peers. At least they were his peers when he used to live in New York City and now lives in Florida. But this was a widely publicized prosecution for which he was found guilty of having committed 46 felonies by allegedly disguising payments in his business records that constituted so-called hush money payments to an adult film actress back in 2017. And the reason it became a felony is that the allegation and the indictment and in the conviction is that the payments violated federal campaign finance laws and therefore elevated these misdemeanors for allegedly wrongful business records to a felony. So the claim was you made these payments and you disguised them because you didn't want to violate federal campaign finance laws. Now, most people don't think that that's really in the jurisdiction of local prosecutors in New York or anywhere else and juries there, that it's in the Federal Election Commission issue. Was this claim ever addressed by the Federal Election Commission as to whether these payments...
Jan, I'm sitting here as you're saying this. I don't know if my anger towards all of this is coming across, but, I actually testified before the House Judiciary Committee over this very subject. What Alvin Bragg engaged in New York is nothing short of 100% partisan lawfare against President Trump. But more importantly for me, and the reason that I wanted to testify in front of the Judiciary Committee was I think he trounced all over the jurisdiction of the Federal Election Commission. The issue that you were talking about was his former lawyer, Michael Cohen, he paid some money to Michael Cohen. Michael Cohen had used that money for various purposes, and whether or not they were actually legal fees and those type of things. There were several complaints filed with the Federal Election Commission that we had. And in the process of those being there, the people had also brought the folks at the Justice Department had decided that they wanted to do a criminal investigation into that as well. So we
ought to make it clear to our audience that the Federal Election Commission has civil enforcement authority. Yes. It's exclusive. Yes. And the Justice Department, if they think a crime has been committed, they can enforce the campaign finance laws against the defendant criminally.
Yes, they can. Now, I will say what I find most interesting about that in the original, if you look at the Federal Election Campaign Act, I mean, it takes into contemplation the fact that there could be criminal activity associated with it. But what it contemplates is that you would complete a civil investigation and you'd come up with some sort of solution and maybe a civil fine of some sort and some reporting requirements. Because again, as we were talking about a minute ago, what's important here is the disclosure element so that the public knows about it. We were not allowed to complete that civil investigation portion because the Justice Department came in and said, hey, we'd like for you to stop any investigation that you have going on. We'd like for you to send over all the records that you have, and we'd like to conduct a criminal investigation.
And when did the Justice Department do that?
They did it shortly after the Biden administration came in. So this would have been at the end of the Trump administration, beginning of the Biden administration. So the Biden administration, DOJ, calls and asks for information, asks us to send it over. Now, it takes a vote of the commission to actually abate our proceedings and for it to go over, for us to send that information over. I have been the lone voice against abating any proceeding. And it wasn't just in the Michael Cohen case. I've done this in every case where the Department of Justice has asked. I've always consistently voted against abating our proceedings because I think that the justice is served best for us to conclude the civil process and to then, if we find wrongdoing, to make a referral of criminal activity over to the Department of Justice for two reasons. One, I think it's a stronger referral when you have the organization that's responsible and knows everything about campaign finance law to say, hey, we've really looked at this and we really think there's a violation. So that's the first reason why I think we should wait. But the second reason I think the reason we should wait is because there are certain rights to the defendant that attach with that process as well. If they are cooperative in the investigation with the Federal Election Commission at sentencing on the criminal side, the federal judge is required to take into consideration that they were cooperative with the Federal Election Commission as part of the sentencing guidelines. And it's right there in FECA that they're allowed to put that type of information in front of the judge in consideration of sentencing. So I think it's important for the FEC to conclude their work. But nonetheless, we sent through a vote of the commission, we sent the information over about Michael Cohen, Donald Trump, everybody over to the Department of Justice. They spent approximately 3.5 years or longer investigating all of that in front of a grand jury, frankly, multiple grand juries, looking at all the information, subpoenas here, there, and everywhere, looking at all of it. They ultimately concluded that there was no federal crime that occurred. And so what they did is they put all of that back in a box and they sent it back to us and said, okay, we're done with our criminal investigation. Y'all can have this back. Now, FECA has a statute of limitations for when we have to act. When we got it back from the Department of Justice, the statute of limitations had run or was going to run within a matter of months when we got it back. And the reason it's important to know that it was going to run is because our statute has in place specific guidelines. If we make an initial determination that there may be a violation of the law, we're required to give the other side time to negotiate with us on a settlement. So we have to give them 30 days, depending upon what it is, 30 days, 60 days, depending upon where we're at in the process. So when you say there's only a month left in the time, even if we said, okay, yeah, there is something wrong here, the time to prosecute those on our side, on the civil side, was going to run and the statute of limitations was going to run. So when we got it back, we decided the same thing. There's no violation of federal law here and the cases were dismissed, which is what was so surprising to me to see Alvin Bragg in New York to take the actions that he did when both the Justice Department had said that there's no violation of the law, when the Federal Election Commission, who's the experts on what reporting needed to be done and how it needed to be done, I mean, all of it, frankly, was handled very well as far as the reporting of the Michael Cohen expenditures were handled. All of it was done correctly. And yet for Alvin Bragg to take that and use it to bootstrap in some state violations of reporting. So
just to be clear,
yeah,
when you got the case back from the Justice Department, you were running up against the statute of limitation. And the commission, the 6 commissioners, voted to do what?
Well, ultimately, I think the vote was ultimately 5-1, but we exercised our prosecutorial discretion and dismissed the case.
So you dismissed the case, and in part because you were running up against the statute of limitations?
Yes,
or did the commission say, there was no reason to believe that our law was violated.
We did have a split so we agreed that there should be a dismissal amongst the Republicans and the Democrats. There are two different reasons for that. One, and I'd have to go back and look at it specifically, but I think the Democrat side was mostly based upon we just don't have time to look at it, the procedural argument of statute of limitations. On the Republican side, it was, yes, we have the procedural statute of limitations argument as a header to that. But that aside, looking at this, here's where these transactions would not have been a violation of the law at all either. So you kind of have a mix there. But, the reason I was compelled to go testify in front of the Judiciary Committee, though, was I thought that a disservice had been done to the Federal Election Commission by the Justice Department, especially when they knew that there had been no criminal violation of the law. I felt like they had an obligation to jump in and protect the federal jurisdiction over campaign finance in the New York case, and they did not. On multiple requests to go to New York and say, hey, you can't use this as the bootstrap mechanism because you have no jurisdiction over federal campaign finance law. And at the time that I testified to Congress, I said, if we do this, we're going to allow 50 states now to be able to say, well, we think there might be a violation of federal campaign finance law under our interpretation of what it should be. So I think in some ways we've opened Pandora's box. I'm hoping that on the appeals that come out of the litigation in New York and the Alvin Bragg cases, that we'll get a lot of that clarified, saying that there ultimately was not jurisdiction for a state court to be able to address FECA violations, even with regard to how they related to the various state statutes that were at play there.
Well, that's fascinating, and especially hearing about the delay in returning the case to the FEC. Subsequently, according to press reports, one of the best prosecutors at the Department of Justice was sent up to New York to help Mr. Bragg prosecute that New York case.
Well, what was really interesting is, so that prosecutor was one of the ones who was actually working on trying to get the federal grand juries on the information that had been submitted from the FEC over to the Department of Justice. So not only, and again, remember, those are confidential files. So at the time that those were going on, we could not have given those to anybody other than the Department of Justice for them to know about. So frankly, even if Alvin Bragg's office would have called and asked the FEC for those files, we probably would not have been able to give them to them because they weren't a federal law enforcement agency. So you did have somebody who was at DOJ who left to go to the New York prosecutor's office to be able to do that. And one other point here, I know the most high profile of that is the fact that Donald Trump had this happen to him. But 2 years ago, I testified in front of the Oversight Committee in the House, in the Rules Committee. The House Administration Committee, when they had the oversight hearing for all of us as commissioners. This was actually an issue that I spoke up on because since that time, the Federal Election Commission has entered into a memorandum of understanding to continue this information sharing whenever the Department of Justice asks for it. And I was a little extreme in my language, but I feel very strongly about the fact that we are violating individuals' rights by sharing that information. There's a reason that information that you file with the FEC is confidential, because we believe so strongly in the disclosure element and the transparency element and the money that we have in politics. We want people to be as honest as they can possibly be without fear of any repercussions with the FEC. And by saying that we're going to share information with the Department of Justice when they ask, I think sometimes people are now going to think about it and say, well, maybe I don't want to be as honest as I possibly could. And I think that's a step in the wrong direction. Now, that was a 5-1 vote. I was the only one who voted against the memorandum of understanding. But I will tell you that since that time, my two Republican colleagues, there have been times since then that they have said, well, we're not going to share this information with the Department of Justice. So, I think we're making inroads and people are starting, and even those across the aisle are starting to think about what information do we share and how open do we want to be with that information. So I think we're making progress in the right direction. It's unfortunate that we've gotten there where we're at. But the more we see this lawfare continue to happen around political participation, the more people are going to have to look at those type of things.
Well, thank you for sharing that. We're probably going to learn even more about what has transpired.
I think so, yes.
As a result of these appeals, if they are allowed to go forward. We've talked about what's happened in the past. We talked a little bit about some of the things that are coming up at the commission, like your proposed rulemaking on state political parties. What else do you think is going to be coming up this next year at the Federal Election Commission? Any other big issues, any court cases we ought to keep an eye on?
Obviously the Supreme Court is dealing with the NRSC's litigation. I think that's something that we're going to keep our eye on. I think actually coming from the commission itself, the thing that I'm most interested in is make sure that we, it being an off year, that we get the technology developments done and that we make it more operational and make it more functional for those out there. I mean, it shouldn't be that you have to download our software to be able to upload your information. You ought to be, with all the various cloud-based systems that are out there, you ought to be, if you're using QuickBooks, we ought to have a way that you can just interface with QuickBooks and let everybody go. So,
well, we'll keep an eye on that development. We'll keep an eye on the NRSC case that stands for National Republican Senatorial Committee. It's a case that the NRSC and its co-plaintiffs have asked the Supreme Court to take a look at certain limits that are imposed on political parties when they try to spend some money in support of their nominees, whether it's for president or Senate or House, and they do so in collaboration with those candidates. That type of spending is generally considered to be in-kind contributions subject to limits, dollar limits. So that's a potentially important case that will impact campaigns and also the type of support that their political parties can provide to them. Well, let's wrap this up. We've covered a lot of ground. I've already given you a warning. The way I like to sort of wrap things up with a guest is to see what it is that they're reading, whether they have time to read, and if they do, whether they have any book suggestions for our listeners.
Sure. So I really have two for you. One that I found fascinating, primarily because I'm barred in Texas and grew up in trials here in Texas. So Dan Abrams has a new book out. It's called Kennedy's Avenger, and it's actually about the Jack Ruby criminal trial after he shot Lee Harvey Oswald. It was very fascinating for those that like to read about the law and the development of the law. A lot of the book centers around statements that someone who's under arrest, when they make statements, whether they're admissible in court. And because it was such a public event, I mean, everybody saw Jack Ruby shoot Lee Harvey Oswald, and they could hear actual audio of what was being said in the room at the time. So, it's fascinating to talk about that and the developments that are there and the ultimate appeal that happened in that case. So it really well done book. And so I would recommend that to everybody, especially if you have a keen sense of just a kind of procedural trial tactics. The other one that I would recommend, and one that I'm in the middle of right now, and frankly is probably due for a rewrite, even though it's a relatively recent book, but there's a book by Jared Cohen. It's called Life After Power. And it looks at 5 different presidents, but it looks at them after they have left office and what they did after leaving office. And the chapter that I'm on right now actually has to deal with Jimmy Carter, with his recent passing. But it talks about, what a successful time he had after having been in office. But it starts out with Thomas Jefferson and building the University of Virginia and how successful he was with that. It talks about John Quincy Adams and the effort that he had, and was really one of the first abolitionists, but a president who gets elected to Congress. So it's a great book just to show that you can reach the pinnacle of success in what you consider your professional career, but there are a lot of things that happen after you've reached the pinnacle of success. So it's called Life After Power.
Well, thank you, Trey. Trey Trainor, Vice Chair of the Federal Election Commission. Thank you for those reading suggestions and for your insights on law and politics. I also want to thank our producer, Jody Mayer Piazza, and the Holtzman Vogel Law Firm for its support of this program. Any opinions expressed here are those of the host and our guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of our sponsors or their clients. All of our episodes are available on Buzzsprout, Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts, and other streaming platforms. Thank you all for listening. I hope you'll join us again on the next episode of Early Returns. Have a good day.
Thanks for joining Early Returns, Law and Politics with Jan Baran. We hope you will join us for future episodes, which will continue to bring you voices and insights from the people engaged in our political landscape.